It's high, high, hey, the army's on its way. Held off on cages loud and strong. So wherever we go, you will always know that the army goes rolling along.
Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research, Substack Week in Review, Unscripted, number 35 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber or follower on Substack, or one-time support on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-Fi. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. Welcome all my new subscribers and followers, and thank you for returning subscribers and followers. Your support is very much appreciated. Okay, so I probably got some technical issues with this. Is basically my monitor is not working, so the only thing I have to go by is my voice recorder looking at sound waves, trying to guess if I'm too loud or too quiet. So I apologize to everybody if this is is quieter or louder than normal. I will try to keep my voice in a relatively, trying to guess in the voice waves to make sure I don't go too high or too low, and just try to stay consistent so that when you have your sound, your volume up on whatever you're listening, however you're listening, is that I won't all of a sudden blast your ears out or get so low that you turn up the volume and then I get too high. So I will try to keep this in between, and I apologize for the technical difficulties. So I had this issue one time before 2 weeks ago. I thought I fixed it, but apparently not. So I'll have to figure something out on this going forward. All right, so we had 3 articles this week. Off-ramps and roadblocks as Ukraine and Russia stake out positions. The next one, move over James Bond, here comes the European CIA. And the great tool of Ankara. All right, so the first one is off-ramps and roadblocks as Ukraine and Russia stake out positions. And this is about the Ukraine victory plan and peace negotiations. It does appear that as the U.S. election got closer, there was some pulling back from, or some hesitation by many countries in Europe, and it seems like Russia as well, outside of them having the North Koreans apparently join the fight, mainly around Kursk. It seems like there was a kind of a hesitation to come up with any bold proposals or rejection. So the Ukraine victory plan was presented by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in October 2024. And this was a relatively disappointing plan, because it was many in the West and Ukraine supporters, excuse me, were under the impression that this would actually have a pathway to victory and ending the war, when all it turned out to be was just demands, requests for more weapons. There was some legitimate parts of the peace plan. You can look at some of my other podcasts or articles on that. But basically, nobody was really satisfied. It was basically a request for more weapons, demands from the Russians. Some of the demands were not unreasonable from the perspective that Ukraine was the one that was invaded, but it was also a basic denying the reality of Ukraine during this war. So it was not well received. And the more you read it, and then the more I reach French President Emmanuel Macron's position starting in late 2023, the victory plan looks like it was almost drafted in Paris. And maybe President Zelensky took too many cues from the French, because the French are the only ones that came out and publicly supported the plan in its whole, and said they would try to convince other European nations and Ukrainian allies to support the plan. For the most part, the plan was not really outwardly rejected, but it was press leaked that it was considered unrealistic, incomplete, and they were complete. And the supporters of Ukraine were basically dissatisfied that it actually had no pathway to peace. And even if we gave them, meaning the Ukrainians, all 7 points of their victory plan, which included weapons, there was also 3 secret protocols. It still doesn't. It still didn't explain how this attained peace. So it was just basically, um, I don't want to say ignored. It was basically received and then not supported at that point. And I think many in the West, some probably waiting until after the U.S. presidential elections, were viewing it from the point of view is um, the West is probably going to have to be the one to try to negotiate an end to this war, which is in many aspects unfair to the Ukrainians and President Zelensky. But it just appears that President Zelensky is not really in a, I don't know if it's a mindset or obviously traumatized by the war, because I mean he's obviously been. You got to imagine that's a very high stress position that he is in, constantly having to go out and try to rally support for weapons and financial support for Ukraine, for a war that he didn't ask to be involved in. It just was, again, he was the leader and it was forced upon him. And if people remember, very early in the war, he was trying to negotiate with the Russians to try to prevent the invasion. But anyway, so I'll go from that. So basically, I don't think it. The conclusion seems like he's not the one that's going to be able to lead Ukraine to peace, but he is the leader of Ukraine. His term has run out, but because of martial law and the invasion, all political elections are indefinitely postponed. Writ of habeas corpus is suspended as well. So President Zelensky is the leader of the country, and just because I say this criticism doesn't mean I think he should be removed, but I think he's got a hard time coming up with any type of concessions. Now, the U.S. presidential elections came, and Donald Trump was reelected as the president. And at this point, it became basically public knowledge that the plan was the Ukraine victory plan was basically the life support was pulled on it, and it is no longer a pathway to peace or the victory plan. It looks like basically it's been kind of set aside. And I even read an article that President Zelensky is going back and creating a 10-point, not peace plan, but specific support he needs to continue the war or to seek peace. It's kind of unclear, but it sounds like he's going back to the drawing board. This will be the third time, because the first time was the plan that was the Ukraine 10-point peace plan, which was also rejected, and not outwardly, but it was basically died at the the Swiss Peace Summit earlier this year. So basically the victory plan is dead. And so now there's talk about what is the way forward, because President Trump, or President-elect Trump, has stated that he wants to end the war quickly. The Chancellor of Germany has also stated publicly that he wants the war to end as well. That's Olaf Scholz. So two powerful, large supporters of Ukraine are looking for a way out of the war. They're not talking about abandoning Ukraine, but they want to find a way forward to peace. And that's probably where a lot of disappointment came in from the Ukraine victory program plan, because it just didn't give that pathway to peace. So President Zelensky, when he's been asked about the election of President Trump, he has not really come out publicly one way or another. It seems like with his trip to Pennsylvania, he would have preferred the status quo in the U.S. relationship, but he did present the Ukraine victory plan to then candidate Trump. So he was well aware of that. And they actually, the president-elect and President Zelensky did have a phone call together after the election to discuss peace. After those calls, one thing is President Zelensky has come out and rejected the idea of conceding captured Ukrainian territory for peace, and he's still insisting on NATO membership. Now, one thing you have to go back and remember, going back all the way to 1994 and the Budapest Accords, is Ukraine has desired peace above, or I'm sorry, security above all else. And that is his overriding goal, is he thinks that the only way, only non-nuclear way, is to become a member of NATO. That's the only way to guarantee security for Ukraine. And he is unwilling to give up territory for peace. Most Ukrainians are backing him on this, but a number of polls that the Ukraine government has conducted does show that position is softening. As you could probably say that war fatigue has set in the Ukrainian population. So the one thing President Zelensky has come out is that he has communicated that he fears the West will negotiate on Ukraine's behalf, which he has stated that believes that it will reward aggression and make the aggressor more aggressive. And that is not a unreasonable statement by President Zelensky. It has probably shown its way forward in the past. I think when you look at the West negotiating on behalf of another country, I've made the point of Czechoslovakia in 1938 for the Sudeten Germans, where Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, yelling, or not yelling, but presenting peace in our time, as he walked out holding a piece of paper signed by then Chancellor Adolf Hitler. So it does have a feeling that Ukraine does not want the West to negotiate on their behalf. The issue, as I stated earlier, it seems like President Zelensky is unable to come up with any type of bargaining position that could start peace talks. And so it might get to the point that the West will have to negotiate on Ukraine's behalf and force a settlement on Ukraine. Is that fair to the Ukrainians? No. But there is a reality of continuing the war. There is definitely, would have to say, there is war fatigue in Western Europe and Central Europe. The upcoming administration says they want the war to end quickly. Of course, that doesn't mean anything if the Russians don't want to end the war either. And that's another thing, is that they're not really conceding, though they have changed the tenor of their demands, where going from absolutely no way that they're going to give up any territory to being softer in the way they're presenting it in the press. So now, if they're just trying to leave a period with like an opening for President Trump when he takes office to start negotiations, or at least see what he has to offer, it's unclear. But it seems like Ukraine is basically rejecting the offer for conceding peace. And this apparently comes about is that he has seen President-elect Trump's peace plan for Ukraine. So go into this is that say, yes, Ukraine needs security. I have to remember that above all else. Ukraine needs security. And this is something they've known basically since the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1992. So it is that all their unrealistic demands, if you could actually go back and you review them, it is tied back to the idea of single overarching goal, and that is security. Now, they might look unrealistic. They might look uncompromising, especially consider the position that Ukraine is in this war. it seems like they should be a little bit softer on their demands or be more open, and they're really not. And you can see a lot of it is based on the need for security. Uh, the Russian invasion of 2014, where they seized Crimea and disrupted basically supported a guerrilla war or separatist movement in the Donbass. Um, 2022 and 2014 confirmed Ukraine's worst fears that they stated in the 1994 Budapest Accords. Now, the Budapest Accords, that when the Soviet Union broke up in 1992, Ukraine became the third largest nuclear power in the world. It was the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine. And the fact is, because Ukraine had all those Soviet nuclear weapons still stationed on its territory. So it became the number three nuclear power, though it did not have launch authority to use those weapons. Well, after the fall of the Cold War and President Clinton was pushing, along with the West, well, the West was more, especially in Germany, they were more focused on the reunification of Germany. Many others in the West were looking at the perspective of Eastern Europe becoming part of a larger European system where it was no longer fragmented by East and West and the Iron Curtain. But the U.S. was really focused on the idea of nuclear proliferation and working with Russia, and then the president of Russia at the time, Boris Yeltsin, of trying to find a way to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And one was to get the weapons out of Ukraine and back into Russian hands. That took a while to negotiate, but finally, in the Budapest Accords, Ukraine agreed to give up all the nuclear weapons and return them back to Russia, including the missiles, not just the nuclear warheads, but the missiles themselves, the ICBMs, and all weapons grade or near weapons grade plutonium and uranium, basically nuclear material for weapons, and all the technology. And it took them some time. It took the better part of I think it was 18 years to give up finally everything. And that was mainly the last thing was the transfer of nuclear materials, not necessarily the weapons. The weapons went fairly quickly. If I remember right, it took in 2012 the final nuclear material was moved out of Ukraine into Russia, and Russia took possession of it. And then you had the 2014 invasion, where the Russians seized Crimea and started the separatist movement in Donbass. So call it a coincidence, probably, but the fact is, when the Budapest Accords was signed, part of the agreement was to transfer the weapons, transfer the material, transfer the missiles, all back to Russian control. In exchange, the U.S. and Great Britain would guarantee the security of Ukraine. Now, how they were going to do this, unclear, because clearly there was not a land bridge between U.S. forces in central Germany and possibly Turkey and reaching Ukraine. There, at this time, most of Eastern Europe was in upheaval, throwing off the communist dictatorships and going through and trying to create some market economies. They were not part of NATO. So how Great Britain and the United States were going to guarantee security, it is completely unclear. And it was basically unrealistic, but it's what got Ukraine to sign the agreement and turn over these weapons. Once all that was gone, the U.S. and the U.K. basically ignored the security guarantees to Ukraine. And that was demonstrated in 2014, where the only thing, there were some sanctions against Russia, but the Germans were still buying oil and gas. Europe was still buying oil and gas from the Russians. They increased NATO increased defense spending requirements from whatever countries decided to spend on it to a minimum requirement of 2% of GDP, which was quickly ignored by nearly every NATO country. So basically, the West, once those nuclear weapons were out, basically Europe and the United States didn't care about what was going on in Ukraine as far as security goes. But as you read from my very first article on Substack, is I did talk about, which I think was October 2022. I'm sorry. So it was talking about the involvements of the United States and the West in Ukraine politically, and involvement with Victoria Nuland, and then like people like the Paul Manafort was involved with the political campaign for one side. The Podesta group, which is involved with democratic politics, were involved in Ukraine. So it felt like very much like Ukraine became the new East Germany as far as involvement between the Russians and the West. But from as far as security went, it seemed like the U.S. and U.K. stopped caring after those nuclear weapons were removed. They got what they want, and Ukraine got roughly 18 years, I'll call it 20 years of security, and that was it. So, so when we go into, so that's, again, the overriding concern is security. The Ukrainians have been arguing this since 1994, and they just didn't, I guess you could argue they got it for 20 years. And after that, once the weapons and all the material was removed, the U.S. and U.K. basically stopped caring as far as providing security, but though they did get themselves involved in Ukrainian politics. There's a whole different story behind that between coups and, it was, read about, you can go back to the article, my very first article. It's a long article. It's my longest article. And it was, and there's nothing earth-shattering. It's just a point of view. It's just how involved the U.S., Russia, and the West were involved inside Ukraine prior to the war of 2022. So, again, the overarching concern of Ukraine is security, and based on the events of 2014 and 2022, they were right. Security was a concern, and the Russians did exactly what the Ukrainians feared. So when we think about peace in Ukraine and you think about the Ukrainian side, always think security is the overarching concern, the overarching goal. And with no natural barriers for Ukraine, what is to stop any type of incursion from Russia again, even if a peace agreement is signed? So that's the Ukrainian point of view. Now, Russian President Putin, after the presidential election, has slightly softened his stance on peace talks. He had a meeting where he welcomed new ambassadors, like basically me. I think he invited them to the Kremlin, and he spoke briefly to them. And he did offer that the West and Russia, or the West has basically had no real diplomatic contacts with Russia. They haven't broken off contact, but for the most part, they have very minimal diplomatic relations with the Russians, and the Russians have reciprocated. Now, that's one of the things I talked in my first paper, and I've talked about it before as well in papers after that, is not having any type of real diplomatic contact is a mistake. No back channels. If you have any type of back channel communication with the Russians, somehow your loyalty is in question. When we went through the whole Cold War, as the West and the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, especially after Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, diplomatic contact was maintained between the two superpowers. And it's not like they were liking each other, but they understood not talking was more dangerous than just ignoring each other and trying to guess each other's intent. even though they were probably lying to each other a fair amount of times in those communications, it was at least they were communicating. There was direct appeal between the leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States. And that is barely existent today. And so I think no diplomatic contact is a mistake. You often see when there's when there's international conferences, very, very rarely does the West or the supporters of Ukraine agree to appear at a conference where the Russians are involved or invited, and vice versa. There's been some, but not that many. So the one thing that comes up with Putin has been softening his tone, but he has kind of still going back to his same position, is that Russia would not concede any ground in an agreement. And when he means that, any ground that he has gained through feat of arms, and Russia or Ukraine must acknowledge Russian sovereignty over Crimea. President Putin also asserted that the 2022 Turkish peace proposal that was negotiated in the early spring of 2022 to end the war early on. This was the one that was scuttled after President Zelensky met with Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the UK. This agreement was basically scuttled. Putin says that is still a viable negotiation point for peace talks, though it has contents in it that now the Ukrainians say they will not agree to. I think the Turkish president has tried to re-engage both parties in that. They haven't rejected, either party hasn't rejected, but they haven't accepted either. So the fact that the Russians will not give up any territory, that's some of the deepest concerns of the Ukrainians. Again, that do they give up territory, or even if they don't, or if somehow the Russians agree, they are still susceptible to the Russian invasion. Russia saying they won't give up the territory, and the idea of NATO membership has been basically rejected by both Germany and the United States, and that doesn't include some of the smaller countries that would probably feel the same way, but won't basically let the two big countries of the U.S. and Germany state that forward, because you have to have unanimous consent. As soon as one rejects it, everybody else can stay quiet on it because it is a moot option. So this is kind of playing into the Ukraine's deepest fears. Is you have Russia not willing to give up any territory, and nobody on the Western side is going to push for NATO membership to give Ukraine the security it needs. So they're at this point where Ukraine doesn't see that there's a point to talk because they don't get the security. They have to give up land because the Russians say they won't give it up. And they're not going to get the security they want because the West is basically, at this point, has said that Ukraine cannot join NATO. So this is the fear that, this is when President Zelensky talks about he's got a concern that the West will negotiate peace on the Ukrainians' behalf. So President-elect Trump has introduced a peace plan for Ukraine. It's kind of a high-level one. It's not fully put together yet, but parts of it have been made public. He proposes a ceasefire in a demilitarized zone along the current line of advance, and that he proposes that zone and that demilitarized zone is patrolled by European-only troops. It is assumed those will probably be troops from the NATO countries, but the U.S. troops would not be involved. Ukrainian troops cannot be involved in the demilitarized zone either. The U.S. said that they will provide training and support to Ukrainian troops, but the Europeans will provide the security. It did say that it does give Ukraine the option to join NATO in 20 years. Of course, they have to go through all the steps of NATO accession, but it is possible in 20 years. It is basically trades land for security, and it does offer the path to NATO membership in 20 years. So it does give Ukraine that security guarantee, both by that demilitarized zone patrolled by European troops, and it does offer them a path to NATO in a set time period. Now, it is two things in here: is it's trading land, which the Russians are good with, but the Ukrainians aren't. It offers security with the demilitarized zone and the path to NATO, which Russian is not all right with. So this is a negotiation point that neither side is really, it's got two hard lines where neither side will accept. The one issue that does come up is that European Union membership remains unaddressed in the president-elect's plan, though that would probably that would be a European issue to decide, not a U.S. issue. But it could become a sticking point in the peace negotiations. Why this is important is that European Union membership is obviously Ukraine is going to have to rebuild. The European Commission under President von der Leyen has said that they do want Ukraine part of the European Union. The European Union was working with Ukraine pre-war to work on providing them financial support, but had certain requirements that they start cleaning up their corruption, because Ukraine was considered the most corrupt nation in Eastern Europe. This is not to say that the Russians are not corrupt, but they were the most corrupt nation. So the European Union had made conditions that Ukraine had to meet certain basically certain let's say here is requirements as each aid package comes in, where they had to meet certain guardrails. Okay, saying to improve their corruption issues. So it was basically conditional support, and each time is they had as more support came, the Ukraine government had to address further and further into their corruption issues. So this remains unaddressed, but the European Union is going to have to be involved, because they are going to be the primary ones to help Ukraine rebuild. Not saying the European Union is going to pay for it, but they will probably help arrange for loans and expertise to bring the Ukrainian economy up to standards of Europe. That will be a tall task to be rebuilt and still have to root out the corruption issues, because one thing we all know, war does not improve corruption issues. So a country that already was fighting corruption and then they get inserted with a lot of money and weapons, even the best of countries, that is going to be an area of corruption and waste and fraud. So it's going to be a difficult road for the European Union, but it is required, because you cannot expect Ukraine to rely on the Russians for financial support or the Chinese through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's just not going to work. European Union membership has to be somewhere in that agreement, or it can at least not be specifically set as a condition of the peace talks or the peace treaty, if it ever comes to that. Now, one thing I did make the suggestion is that the NATO may be something that could be more viable to the Ukrainians. Not sure how the Russians would feel about it, but NATO countries would serve as peacekeepers and act as tripwires against Russian attacks. This does not give NATO membership to Ukraine, but it tells the Russians that you cannot attack NATO troops. Otherwise, that's an Article 5 violation, or it will activate Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. So that could be a deterrent for the Russians from attacking the NATO troops. In exchange, the NATO troops cannot carry bring with them the heavy type weapons that could attack deep inside Russia. So no missile batteries, no HIMARS deployed in the demilitarized zone, nothing like that. In fact, it would probably have to be some agreement where all those weapons were not in the Ukraine itself. Again, this is just a suggestion of possibly how a peace could work. So if you create a tripwire, it would encourage Russia to refrain from attacking in the demilitarized zone, but it does commit NATO to increase defense spending and improving its militaries, because if their troops are going to be tripwires, that means that they have to be prepared for war with Russia. So that means when the war is over, they cannot just go back to their old ways of not spending on their defense requirements, which is one of the points that President Trump has criticized NATO countries for, is not enough of them are paying their agreed upon, which 100% of the nations agreed to 2% of the GDP. Still, 1/3 are not even paying that 10 years after the agreement was made. So NATO would still be encouraged to continue the defense spending, because if their troops are going to serve as tripwires along the border with Ukraine and Russia in that demilitarized zone, NATO has to be a true deterrent, and that means they have to have a capability to face the Russians. So I also suggested that maybe there's going to be an opportunity for Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine to vote on whether they stay under Russia or return to Ukraine. Russia was performing, and this has been going back to Stalin days, Russifications of parts of the Soviet Union, which included Ukraine, where they started putting more and more ethnic Russians into areas of these non-Russian states. Despite what President Putin says, Ukraine is a distinct culture. It has its own distinct language. He says it's basically, I think he said it was like it wasn't a real country. It's just part of Russia. So that, but these parts in the eastern part of Ukraine, they are parts that have been heavily Russified. So there are a lot of ethnic Russians. It would not be surprised if the Ukrainians lost that vote. Is that fair to the Ukrainians? No, it's not. One area that I said that could soften the blow is that Donbass region is heavily, or it's very rich in natural resources, coal, mineral, less so in oil and gas, but it does have those. Is if Russia gets to keep portions of that area, it should be through an agreement, a significant portion of any money that is made by the Russians by using those natural resources of the occupied Donbass, the Ukrainians there should be some portion of that goes back to the Ukrainians, where maybe it's like, it won't be an area that they have to try to, I don't want to say control, but govern in a place that's very hard to govern, especially after, call it 10 years of a campaign to separate themselves from Ukraine. Because again, this is a very Russian area, but at least it would give the chance for Ukraine to make at least some portion, a significant portion of any proceeds from the development of that area by the Russians. It would be hard to manage or to monitor, but it seems like that would also give Ukraine some incentive to sign a peace agreement. Again, this is all not part of the Trump peace agreement. This is things where I read into it is things that would, as you expand out, that could possibly go into it. So again, it was just a high level blueprint. I'm just trying to fill in hey, what's the logical points that Ukraine would oppose? What's the parts that the Russians could oppose? And what would be some potential talking points to get both sides to talk? Right now, the Ukrainians are going to reject any of the plans. So any incoming administration is probably going to have to put pressure on the Ukrainians to discuss peace, and that's already being seen in the press by some of the press pushback by President Zelensky, and the Russians are even pushing back by staking out their positions that they're not going to give up any territory. So peace is not going to be easy to obtain in Ukraine, but I've still the belief that at some point it has to be negotiated. It just cannot go on like it is. All right, so obviously more to come. I will continue. This is a topic that everybody has been with me. I talk a lot about Ukrainian peace and the need for it. As the administration gets closer to inauguration, we'll start seeing how everybody's staking out, meaning the West, Ukraine, the United States, how they stake out their positions on this. All right, so obviously more to come. Next article, move over James Bond. Here comes the European CIA. I call the EU a modern-day Leviathan, where it's slowly extending its tentacles into every part of the European member states' internal and external affairs, and the idea of them extending into intelligence collection is just another example. So the European Union, or EU, was established on November 1st, 1993, after the approval of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. The aim of I'll come back to why this is important. The aim of the EU was creating a European citizenship, strengthening the European Parliament, establishing a shared currency, which not all EU countries are part of the Eurozone. That's the name of the currency, the euro. Almost everybody knows that, but just in case. And implementing a common foreign and security policy for the area or for the region. So the EU received a Nobel Prize in 2012 for transforming Europe from a continent of war to a continent of peace. So European leaders, or Europe, congratulating Europe for being so great. And it is true, there's something to be said that the European states used to go to war on a regular basis for hundreds of years, and the European Union is taking credit for ending that cycle. It might be true, might not be true. Maybe part of it is a long period of that was U.S. troops being in the continent for so long during the Cold War. That might have paid for it. But anyway, now in March 2024, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen requested a review of the EU's intelligence readiness, and she assigned the former Finnish Prime Minister Sauli Niinistö. I'm sure I butchered both his names, and that's not intentional. So that was started in March 2024. Now the report was, or the recommendation was released last week. It is not legally binding, but it recommended that the EU expand its intelligence collection power. Basically, it was snidely commented that the European Union is trying to create its own CIA, or call it a KGB. FSB is the replacement for the KGB. That's what they're apparently looks like. They are trying to create. The von der Leyen, President von der Leyen, the European Commission President, suggests that the EU should approach threats proactively and enhance the flow of information and intelligence gathering through existing EU security bodies. That was part of her statement that she accepted. President Niinistö had suggested that the European Union go out and actively create a intelligence body. Now, the former Finnish Prime Minister, Niinistö, recommended the establishment of a, quote, fully fledged intelligence cooperation service at the EU level to, and that's end quote, to serve strategic and operational needs. He also stated that EU member countries should trust each other and begin sharing their information through the EU system. The areas that President von der Leyen would like to see expanded is the European Union Intelligence and Situation Center and the European Union Center for Information and Security. So the EU does have intelligence sections, but they are not operational intelligence. They pull information that is given to them, whether through public sources or maybe provided by other European Union member states' intelligence services as they see fit. Not the EU, but as the member state sees fit. And they do a lot of the stuff similar to what I do, try to guess using sources available to them to make assessments of intelligence. The difference is it is not operational. So it is basically a information service is basically what you could call it. Now they could have intelligence professionals in there from member countries, but again, they don't task to get intelligence. So the directive that came from Mr. Niinistö establishes trust between the idea, this is a statement, is part of the directive is to establish trust between the European countries in intelligence sharing. The initial strategy involves European countries collecting and disseminating information to the EU intelligence services. So when you talk about the difference between operational, is the EU can disseminate information that it receives either through public sources or what European Union countries or the United States wants to give them. But so they can do the disseminating part. The EU does not do the collection part outside of publicly available information. So that's the idea of having a service that monitors communications, spies, through human intelligence, spy satellites. The EU does not do collection. And so this is the idea of operationalizing an intelligence service. So it would take those two existing EU bodies, the European Union Intelligence and Situation Center and the European Center for Information and Security, and basically operationalize them. So the question comes around the arrangement. So all these countries have, I made the point of move over James Bond. Okay, James Bond, everybody knows that of anybody that knows intelligence services in Europe is, everybody comes to think, at least in the US, James Bond. I know Great Britain, United Kingdom is not part of the European Union. It was just an example of a European intelligence service. That's so. So I know that the United Kingdom is not part of the European Union because that's what Brexit was about. So anyway, the question remains whether the arrangement will involve an EU country that's in intelligence services pushing the information they collect, basically saying, I pull this information through my collection effort, whether it's through human intelligence, signals intelligence, or reconnaissance like from satellites, photo intelligence, and pushing them up to the EU, to those two centers. Well, what that does is that has those intelligence services within the European Union deciding what they send to the EU for dissemination. The assumption is that if the EU has it, that will be accessible. Obviously, there will be security requirements to other nations. So if the Germans collect something from human intelligence about Russia, they would feed it up to the European Union country, to the EU's, those two centers, and then that would be accessible by the EU organization to its other member states. So German intelligence could be available to all the member countries of the EU. Now, that's the idea is with Mr. Nienstu saying European countries have to trust each other. Because the idea is that if the Germans collected this, and maybe it's very sensitive and it could, if it finds out, it could compromise their source. If they send it up to the European Union, can they guarantee that their source will be secure? Because remember, in this push arrangement, the intelligence services of each of the states is still responsible for doing the collection of the intelligence. And then they do their own dissemination, but they also push it up to the European Union to have their dissemination. Now, the issue with this, again, is trust. Will the German intelligence or French intelligence or whatever intelligence in the EU, will they trust their other countries enough to send their information up there? And why I say that as an example is Hungary is kind of on the outside list of many of the traditional EU countries. For example, would France feel comfortable sharing intelligence information to the EU in a risk that it could be sent, that Hungary could access it? And since Hungary, unfairly, in my opinion, is not trusted by the EU, and or other EU or other member states of the EU, would France be willing to share that information to the EU if they thought it was going to end up in the hands of the Hungarians? Also, could the EU determine which countries could have access to this information? Just as much as when you disagree with the EU, they fine you. Hungary can tell you all about that. Would they be willing to would the EU be at the point where they decide whether you can have intelligence or not that they have gathered from other countries or other EU countries send up to them? The other one is what I called a pool arrangement, and basically the EU decides what they want to take. So they have access to, let's say, all the intelligence services. Let's say they put their all their information is available in their current secure environments, but the EU in Brussels has full access to that information and can pull whatever it wants. Now, that has to go on the assumption that the individual European Union countries that are collecting the intelligence will allow all that information to be sent, or will they create another level of security to prevent full dissemination? Kind of goes back into what Mr. Nienstu said, is they got to trust each other. I am not promoting trust between one way or another, but the 27 countries that make up the EU all have different priorities. And so maybe what's a priority for one, it's not a priority to the other. So it goes into how this arrangement, and then is it a push-pull arrangement, or is it a push where the individual countries send the EU saying they're being open and honest and sharing all the information, but really just sharing whatever they want? Or is it a pull arrangement where the EU takes what they want, whether or not they have the individual countries have another level of security to prevent some information from being transferred to the EU? That's another issue upon itself. So it comes to, and the other part is tasking. Right now, the individual countries determine what their priorities are for collecting intelligence and developing their own sources or using their own methods to collect intelligence. And then whatever their collection priorities, they send it up to the EU. Will the EU make a determination of tasking? The EU decides how assets are going to be used. And is the EU going to start creating their own assets? At some point, the arrangement of state level, the individual countries in the EU providing the intelligence, will eventually have to be superseded by some type of organization controlled by Brussels in the EU. So The push-pull arrangement is just a transitionary period until the EU can find some way to fully centralize all the intelligence. Now, is it going to be like, are they going to create their own CIA and just basically take all these countries and their services and have them all roll up and report to the European Union, much like what happened when the CIA was created in 1947, where they took the OSI and the OSS and some other services and collected it all under Central Intelligence. And everything started, if you're OSI here and OSS here, is eventually you're all part of CIA. Is that something the European Union at some point will do once they get past the push-pull arrangement? I say why they have to have those push-pull arrangement, because they can't just immediately turn on and become an intelligence service like the CIA. They have to build up some capability. They have to build up the organization to do it. They have to work through all the processes. And you don't want to shut down European Union intelligence, individual countries of the EU. You don't want to shut down their intelligence services while you're trying to get your stuff together. So that's why I think there have to be some type of push-pull arrangement. And eventually that the European Union, the goal is they will take over all tasking, and eventually they will be the ones to run the whole organization. So will they create something, basically just fuse everything together into one EU intelligence services through the European Union Intelligence and Situation Center and the European Center for Information Security, and just have everything combined? So if you were German and French and Belgium and Dutch intelligence, all of those things will all roll up under, you're now no longer Dutch intelligence, you're under the European Union Intelligence and Situation Center. So is it going to be that? Or is it going to be something like what happened after 9/11 in the United States, where they created the U.S. intelligence community, and basically that's when we had created the DNI, Director of National Intelligence, where all 19 intelligence services of the United States, including the CIA and NSA and other services, all rolled up under and reported to the U.S. intelligence community and the DNI. So is that going to be an arrangement where you're still Dutch intelligence, German intelligence, and French intelligence, and then you operate as before, but you report directly to the EU, and your tasking comes from, you lose a lot of your flexibility because it goes up to the EU. So again, similar to U.S. intelligence community. And the idea was to take down the walls between that was preventing security, intelligence sharing between U.S. intelligence services prior to 9/11. Of course, there's security risks with that. That would be something, again, what EU would have to create. And that's why I say at some point they have to allow the push-pull arrangement in some type of manner. Now, there's obviously questions of what's the purpose of the EU's collection of intelligence. Obviously, as we've gone further and further in this world, is cyber warfare, intelligence collection on cyber warfare, industrial espionage outside of military and military production, terrorism, which is actually more of a law enforcement function than a intelligence service collection, at least traditionally. But those are things that have outcome. But when intelligence was first collected, but the real reason of military intelligence or of intelligence was for military intelligence, was to be able to threat assessment of what the dangers were to your country. Usually you knew what the enemy was, but that was the purpose of intelligence services, was to get some type of military edge over your competitor, whether it was form of espionage, stealing secrets, including production secrets, stealing their information, finding ways to collect information against them. The idea was to serve a military purpose. Well, the EU doesn't have a military. So what is the real purpose of the EU needing an intelligence apparatus like the CIA? And it kind of goes back to this whole thing is creating the creation of the European Union, creating a European citizenship, strengthening the European Parliament, establishing currency, None of these have anything to do with intelligence collection. And then they go implementing common foreign and security policies. So when does intelligence serve a security policy? Okay, but it's not to the point that the EU has got to the point that they can have a military, because the primary first role of security is protection of the state. Well, the European Union is not a state. They have again, they have a lot of integration. The idea is they've always, when it first came out, the Maastricht Treaty was being negotiated. They talked about it as like a United States of Europe, but it is not the United States. It doesn't have a common, all-incorporative constitution. It doesn't adopt a federalist type model like the United States, or even like Germany is a federalist model, or a federal model. So why do you need, if you don't have a military, why do you need an intelligence collection apparatus? What's the purpose for it? Are these countries, is this a step to eventually move into intelligence collection or military? For example, how you reach that is, let's say all these countries eventually give up all their tasking and all their role of collection, but the militaries are still running their own operations because there's not an EU military. But now the EU has an intelligence service. But your militaries are now blind to the threats around them, and the only reason you know what the threats are around them is that the European Union decides to share it with you. And now maybe in the open arrangement they start sharing it with you. But then the EU goes to the point of saying, we want our own EU military, and they've had conversations about this. And they go in there and say, well, let's say 20 countries agree and the seven don't. Is the EU going to cut them off from intelligence collection until they agree to the European Union's position of wanting to create a military? So what's the purpose of this? Is this something to leverage? It's putting the cart before the horse. Is if you are going to get in a position that you need some type of collection of intelligence, mainly from the military sphere, like collecting against Russia, well, it's okay, that's part of your security, but your basic level security is your military. It's your police forces. It's not intelligence. The intelligence comes after the fact. So they're putting the cart for the horse. Is this some type of pressure tactic involved? And again, intelligence is full of a lack of transparency. That's why it's intelligence. That's why it's secret. So we don't have all the transparency purposes, but it doesn't seem to make any sense. Why would you create a centralized intelligence services for these countries to give up their intelligence collections abilities without having a military? And if you don't have a military, and you want to form one, are they going to use this as a pressure tactic to force these countries to agree to give up their sovereignty in both their sovereignty in military, on the condition that the EU has cut them off from maybe some type of funding, or they fine them, or they cut them off from all types of intelligence, so that a country that was once able to tell the threat assessment around them are now blind to the threats around them. I really question the purpose of this EU position. It feels like, again, if you want to have a military, you form the military first, and then you go into intelligence collections. Now, this is not supported by Czechia has come out as the first country to be against this idea. And so the question is, and of course, what like all bureaucracies go in there is that they can always find a rule for itself. And the EU is a big bureaucracy. Do they have to have unanimous consent to create a operational intelligence service? If they have to have unanimous consent, they don't have it. And so it's a question of how will they do this? It is unsure if they can just mission creep themselves into it, or do they eventually have to come face to face with it and put it for a membership vote? It's unclear on that, but they've decided that this is an urgent issue. Their words, not mine. So they determined this is something that needs to be urgently addressed. Don't know what the urgency is if you don't have a military. So it seems like this is just a power grab within a centralized authority. I've also briefly talked about in the paper is, yes, Europe is a democratic, they do have democratic principles. They do stick to them. They have strong laws, but in their constitutions, or however they call them over there, I think basically we think of them as constitution. Their rule of law of countries. They do have democratic traditions. They have elections. But the one thing they don't have is they don't have the strong individual rights like the United States has. They don't have the first, the fourth, the fifth amendments. They don't have those in there. So because the European approach to liberty is your rights are granted by government, where in the U.S. it's unalienable. Just the fact that you're a person means you get these individual rights, and the government doesn't grant rights, the government protects rights. It's so a lot of European countries, not all, but most of them have this basically is your rights are granted by government, so the government can give them to you, the government can take them away. And the reason why that comes important is the U.S., with our strong individual rights that are written in the Constitution, have had a hard time with the CIA or other intelligence communities violating people's rights. I could not imagine what it would be like in the European Union with their weaker controls over the protection of individual rights. They'll say, well, how is that possible? It doesn't really mean anything if you don't enforce it. And that's true. Your constitutional rights don't mean anything if your government's not going to protect them. But I look over in Europe, and they don't have a lot of First Amendment rights. You see a lot of people getting in trouble over tweets. I mean, a lot of them, fair amount, are coming out of England, which is not part of the EU anymore. But I do see it in Ireland, which is a part of the EU, Sweden, which is part of the EU. So there are countries that do prosecute free speech matters. If you are that weak on individual rights, are you going to respect the rights of your citizenry from an I won't say all incorporative, but another power given to the EU in this super state organization? It does seem there is risk, and I would like to hope that if Europe decide, or European Union and the European Union members agree to this, is that they at least give their citizens more protections from collection from the EU. Also, that the EU can't use denying countries intelligence because they're mad about they don't accept the European Union's open border policies or their immigration policies. Go looking at Hungary and Czechoslovakia or Czechia and Poland all have run afoul of the EU at one time or another over not accepting the EU's mandates. So more to come. I think this is one of those things is it's not going to be talked about a lot. So I want to actually come back and revisit it when I can. I just don't see a lot of information coming out on it as it winds its way through the great bureaucracies in Brussels and Strasbourg. But it will be interesting to see if the Europeans go down this path. Again, if nothing else, I think they have to address the military issue before they address the intelligence issue, or at least go hand in hand with the two. And they're trying to put, in my mind, in the history of intelligence collection, they are, and the primary role of intelligence collection, they're putting the cart before the horse. All right, so the last one, this will be a relatively short article. It was a short article. The Great Tulip Ankara. And I'm talking about you, President Erdogan. I've talked about or wrote about in a number of papers about, I think I've got one short article and one long article about Turkey applying for BRICS, which is the rival to the Western-led G7. And it's one of those organizations that wants to create alternative ways of finance and international trade, including currency, where they want to use, instead of relying on dollars for trade or a basket of Western currencies, they want to have their own currency or have each country trade in their own individual currency. So because BRICS looks at as the G7 and nations that adhere to the Western-led G7 are keeping down the or they're taking advantage of the global south. So BRICS is meant to basically start creating an alternative to the Western-led rules-based order, mainly in international trade and finance. The BRICS countries argue that the benefits the West, I'm going to read this quick note I have on it on that point, is BRICS countries argue the benefits that the G7 rules-based order benefits the West at the expense of the developing economies. I just made that point. I should have made it earlier. So that's why that's the motivation for BRICS. So Turkey has an interest in BRICS, and there's two unofficial divides in BRICS. You have led by the Russians and the Chinese. They're not the only ones, but led by the Russians and the Chinese. Is you have the anti-Western part of BRICS, and then you have other parts of BRICS is the ones that are unaligned, and the one that stands out the most on this is India. Where they want to be unaligned. They don't want to align themselves with the West, but they don't want to align themselves into any other type of alliance system, which the Chinese say that's what they believe too, but their belief is they don't want anybody else involved in a alliance, but they're fine with them being part of an alliance. So that's why, to me, the China falls in the anti-Western. So two divides. You have the non-aligned side, countries that want to stay non-aligned, and then you have the anti-Western side. Turkey lies in a unique geographic position in the world. They are basically, they're part European, they're part Asian. Vast amount of Turkey lays inside of Asia in the Levant, but it does have a small part within Europe. So it is that dividing between East and West, Europe and Asia. And so Turkey has said that they want to serve as not only the bridge geographically, but politically want to be that bridge between the East and the West and be part of basically both worlds. So based on that, Turkey kind of falls into the unaligned countries. Now, that's a bold statement for a country that is member of NATO. And Turkey would be the only NATO country in BRICS, a organization that is led by the Russians and the Chinese as part of the anti-Western bloc. The non-aligned countries, because they don't want to get involved in politics or get involved in international, the bipolar world, stay basically, there's no counterbalance to them. So you have an organization led by Russia and China in an anti-Western orientation, and Turkey, a NATO member, wants to become a member of that organization. Now, Turkey has obviously gone down the road a number of times. They purchasing Russian equipment, even though they're a NATO country, and that got them booted out of the F-35 program. I say that it was a decision made by the Turkish government to leave F-35 though in actuality they were kicked out. But they made that decision. It was clear if they made a decision to buy SA-400s, so Russian-made anti basically air defense missiles, they were going to get kicked out of the F-35 program. So Turkey has already flirted with the Russians and have acted outside of the interests of NATO and the United States. Turkey has recently petitioned to get back in the F-35 program, trying to find some type of an agreement with the United States that the Russians will agree on the disposition of the SA-400 missiles. So I wrote an article about that. So already you have Russia going to have a say-so because as long as those SA-400s are in Turkey, the United States is limiting its technology and not allowing Turkey to get into, or technology transfers to Turkey. And there are some sanctions in place, but most importantly, they're keeping them out of the F-35 Lightning II fighter program. So, and why Russia has influence is that Russia, and the United States has the same thing, Russia can make a decision of how those SA-400s are to be managed. So Turkey cannot just simply turn the missiles over to the U.S. and let the U.S. make a disposition on them, because the Russians won't allow that. That's the issue that we run into in Ukraine, where a European country says, "Hey, I want to sell these weapons to Ukraine and allow them unlimited use of these weapons." Well, if the weapon has U.S. technology or is made in the U.S., the U.S. has final say-so on how that weapon is to be used. It is the same thing with the SA-400. The Russians have a say-so in what happens to where those missiles can go. And as long as those missiles are there, Turkey cannot get the technology or the F-35 like they want. So here you've got Russia having some influence already within Turkey because of a decision that President Erdogan made. Now, President Erdogan is making this decision that he wants to join BRICS with those very same Russians while he's still in NATO. This will kill him, any chance of him getting the F-35 if he gets into BRICS. So this week I did argue that there's no way that Russia will not offer BRICS membership to Turkey, because they know that they could use Turkey to be a disruptive force inside NATO. And that's what happened. They created a new type of membership called a partnership program, and they extended it out to like 13 other countries, including Turkey. So Turkey is now has been offered partnership with BRICS. Turkey has not accepted it, but they haven't rejected it either. So the question is, if Turkey accepts it, how much influence are the Russians going to have in Turkey's decision? Turkey is not a part of the EU, but they are part of NATO. And NATO has that requirement that all decisions have to be unanimously approved. So if Turkey goes in there and uses its veto power and stops a NATO decision, the question is going to come, are they doing that on behalf of the Russians? Do they become the Russian voice inside NATO? Not saying Turkey's going to do that, but the suspicion's going to be there. Now, the argument's going to be Czechia and to a lesser extent the Slovak Republic and Hungary are all countries that sorry, I had to stop recording for a second. It was a noise. They go in there, Czechia and Slovakia and Hungary have cordial relationships with the Russians. So are they using their veto to support the Russians? And the fact why I'm saying that they're not is because those three countries are also part of the European Union, where Turkey is not part of the European Union. So the the Russians will have some leverage on possibly economic decisions that affect Turkey. So it will give a leverage. It will give the Russians and the Chinese a leverage against Turkey to help them get influence in Turkey on NATO decisions. And so, yes, Hungary and Slovakia and Czechia, I think, well, there's other countries, but they'd still get oil and gas through an agreement to get oil and gas from Russia. Well, they say, well, what if Russia uses that energy to affect those three countries to make decisions at NATO on their behalf? The European Union has already created, and they're trying to get them to go, these three countries to move away from Russian oil and gas. The European Union already has a way that if they get those three countries get cut off from Russian gas and oil, there's a way that Europe will provide those countries energy. It'll be more expensive than what they're getting from Russia, but they would not be cut off completely. So the European Union is protecting those countries from being leveraged economically by the Russians, and then they're also part of NATO, so they can't be leveraged militarily. The Turks are leaving themselves open to be leveraged both economically and militarily with the SA-400, but also the Russians could use economic pressure on Turkey to help to get them to make a decision on the behalf of Russia in NATO decision, because again, the unanimous requirement. And even if Turkey's not going to do that, the appearance could be brought up. Turkey is already suspicious of with President Erdogan because of what he's done with the Turkish diaspora in Germany, getting them to protest the prior chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel. Also, he's had disagreements with Finland, Sweden, and not France, Italy, over Greece is another one he's had a lot of disagreements with. So Turkey's already kind of been kind of that disruptive influence, and now so there's already countries that are already within the European Union and NATO that are suspicious of Turkey, and rightly so. And so now they're going to look at if Turkey becomes part of BRICS, are they going to act on behalf of the Russians? Even if they're not, if they start taking policies that benefit the Russians because they use their veto power, they are going to be looked upon suspiciously. So that is an issue for NATO, and you can already see just by explaining this disruptive influence, that is the Russians' motivation for getting the Turks in, offering them membership to BRICS, because now they can act as a disruption to the Western order. And when I've talked about this in another paper, is that when the Russians had talked about creating these red lines, and the West is like, well, we crossed this red line and nothing happened. You had, okay, nothing happened. So all of a sudden you have North Korean artillery shells sitting in, being sent to Russia to be shot at Ukraine. And then you have Iranian missiles in Russia. You have the UN weapons monitoring program against the North Koreans. All of a sudden, the Russians veto that. The Russians sell weapons to the North Koreans and say you can use them however you want. Just like where the SA-400 has to have Russian permission prior to being transferred, the Russians have basically lifted that requirement from the North Koreans. So just because they cross a red line in Ukraine and there's not a military reaction within Ukraine, it doesn't mean that Russia's not taking actions against the West for the Russians' escalation or the West's escalations and crossing of Russian red lines, that nothing's happening. When you go back and look at what the world order was prior to February 2022 and what it is today, and how it's speeding up as more and more Russian or Western support and more red lines are crossed, Now, I'm not saying that the Russians are correct. I'm just saying that when the impression in the West or gets in the media is, hey, we've crossed all these red lines and the Russians haven't done shit, excuse my language, that is simply not true. When you look at all the disruptive factors that are going on inside areas in international affairs, mainly in weapons agreements, the Russians were on board, along with as well as the Chinese, on trying to limit the North Korean nuclear program. There was concerns with also with North Korean missile programs. Basically, the Russians have cut all that up. In fact, they're encouraging disruptions on the Korean Peninsula, and in this case, mean the Western Pacific, making it more volatile in that region. So it's the fact is saying, oh, well, the Russians hadn't done anything when these red lines were crossed. That is simply not correct. So it will be interesting to see what happens. If Turkey is going to accept this membership, what will that do? NATO does not have the ability to kick anybody out. It's just not part of their bylaws. You can exit voluntarily. The French partially did that under de Gaulle. But there's no way for NATO to kick a country out. Again, unanimous consent. If let's say all the member states of NATO draft us say, hey, we want to kick Turkey out, there's unanimous consent requirement. Turkey can veto it. Things dead. So there's no way to kick anybody out. And I don't think the U.S. would ever agree, and I don't think the United Kingdom would either. And there's probably other countries would ever want to kick Turkey out because of the geographic position that Turkey has, especially while the war in Ukraine is still going on. The Black Sea is a major factor because Turkey manages the entrance and exit outside of the Black Sea through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. It holds a strategic position in the Eastern Mediterranean, around the Middle East. It plays a role in Syria, plays a role in Iraq, along with in the Kurdish regions. It borders the former Soviet Republic. U.S. still keeps nuclear weapons there at Islaric Air Base. So they don't want to kick. So there is plenty of reasons not to kick Turkey out, even if they could. But what it does create is, will NATO start restricting availability of information due to concerns that if Turkey is part of an economic union with Russia, are they concerned that Turkey could share that information? So it turns into NATO creates and starts restricting availability of sensitive data. And if they do that, then, you open up Pandora's box, and then NATO starts publicly cutting off other countries from receiving information. So NATO doesn't publicly do that. I'm sure there's probably some restriction because, again, it goes back at the EU. NATO doesn't have a intelligence service. They require the member states to provide intelligence to NATO. And then, so if a country doesn't want NATO to disseminate it to other NATO members, they withhold it. There could just be another restrictive access to information given to Turkey because of concern that they might be potentially compromised by the Russians. So it kind of goes back into the other thing, is like talking about intelligence collection. European Union is not part of NATO. It could blind NATO to having access to intelligence that's currently provided by member states. If that moves into centralized European Union intelligence, you're blinding NATO outside of the United States and Canada. Norway's not part of the EU. So you do cut off a lot of the, you would blind NATO to military intelligence as well. So kind of, that was unintentional, but closing the circle there. So that is it for this week. I think it's a mistake that Turkey has gone down this road. I don't know if they're trying to leverage some type of something from the United States as far as we won't join if you get us back into the F-35, or we won't join if the European Union accepts us. That's, again, the European Union needs unanimous consent. I don't see them agreeing to that, but maybe this is Turkey trying to force concessions from some of its international partners. So it is unclear. All right, so that is it for this week. Thank you for joining. I had added 4 new countries to the that I've heard. So I'm heard in 63 countries, so that was kind of exciting. I had this weird thing this week with members. The followers had slowed down a little bit, actually quite a bit. But at one point, I lost almost 2% of my subscribers, which isn't much because I don't have a lot of subscribers. And I went through a period where I did not get a single new subscriber for almost 5 days. That's the first time that's ever happened so every day I was seeing it go down, 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 down. And usually when I see it going down, I usually get another subscriber. So I'm always on this kind of pace upwards. So I'm back on a pace upwards. So I just this morning, got up to the point that I was when I lost 2% of my subscriber count. So that was kind of interesting. Now I did add another paid subscriber this week. So that was nice. So if you're listening, thank you. I appreciate the support. If you would like, I appreciate any subscribers because, again, I talk about it. It's you hate to make it a numbers game, but when you're talking about having some authority to speak on a subject, somebody that's got 1,000 or 14,000 subscribers has a lot more sway than somebody that has 267. So it is a numbers game. So any type of support you give me, as far as if you become a subscriber on Substack, or even a follower, because I know you can be a follower and a subscriber. So I have like 700 and something followers, 267 subscribers. If you definitely help me out if you join. If you want to just give one-time support, you can go to Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-Fi. As I had one issue last week was there's some information on defense deficits within Europe, basically after 30 years of not paying their bills, how far these countries were behind. I couldn't afford access to that documentation or that study. So that's a case where if I start getting more revenue, it would help me be able to purchase something like that. Also, I'm available. I do some work that if you need research done, because that's originally when it was Pegasus Research. I used to do some research for people, like when, for example, they want to know what their family did during the war. I couldn't tell you exactly what that family member did, but I could tell you the journey that they had of the war. And I did that for a number of people. Also, people that need help with research papers. I help do some of the research for a price. So if you're interested in that, you can contact me. So again, it's I don't like having to ask for money. And I will continue to provide plenty of free content. I have at this point, in the near future, I don't plan on offering exclusive, or I will always have free content. I have no intent of cutting off my current level of content. I am looking at some options to provide paid subscribers exclusive content. But I don't do that right now. So everything you see today offered by me today would still be available to the free subscribers, at least in the near term. And we'll see how that goes. But yeah, so I'm looking at the point of trying to build a subscriber base or a revenue stream to help pay for, to get more in-depth information that I have to pay for research. Or if it's pushing for needing better videos, getting a better video service, or maybe even something to help video production. would be an option. But right now, it's really dependent on being able to get a better revenue stream. So that's why I asked for donations or paid support. That's why I asked for it, just to be able to have access to more information. And also because I said it's a numbers game. Even if you don't want, if you're in a position where you can't support or you don't want to support financially, that I understand that. Become a subscriber, because again, it's a numbers game. And when I get into where I'm trying to recommend my services for researching, it helps if you have a fair amount of subscribers. I don't have the names like Dan Rather. Can you believe he's still alive? That's ugly to say. Dan Rather, who's still writing, like he's got the name, big time names. I don't have that. I'm not a government official, and so I don't have people coming to me for advice necessarily. So that's why I talk about, even if you can't support financially, please consider becoming a subscriber or a follower to help me in that numbers game. I have cut down on the number of emails I send to everybody. I do have RSS feeds. I would thought about just packaging all my media formats into one email and send it to you out per week. But I also use RSS feeds that Substack provides that goes to different podcasting services. And so if I send a lot of these files into one emails or embed videos or embed audio, I lose my RSS feed. So I do have to at least send out some multiple emails to be able to take advantage of the RSS feeds on Substack. So that is my advertisement for today and my ask for any support that you can, whether it's subscribing or paid subscriptions or donations. So, but I want to say, everybody, thank you for all that have joined me starting this week, and all the subscribers and followers that have been with me since this journey or along this journey. I greatly appreciate it. I hope all of you have a great week, and we will talk to you next week. Bye.